Under the pale glow of an autumn moon, in a town quietly fraying at the edges of forgotten legends and fractured hopes, a man named Elias Thorne found himself standing alone at the threshold of an overgrown path that twisted through the old Wren Hollow woods, his breath visible in the chill of the evening air, his heart pounding with an urgency he couldn't quite explain, for it had been many years since he last believed in anything beyond the predictable routine of his quiet, solitary life. And yet here he was, driven by something deeper, older, as though a story long buried in the marrow of his bones was calling him home. And at his feet lay the reason he had ventured out into the creeping darkness in the first place. A dog, or what appeared to be a dog, but was unlike any animal he had ever seen before, with fur the color of twilight clouds and eyes that reflected an ancient sorrow. And though its body bore the marks of great wounds, deep gashes that told of battles fought in silence, its gaze held a quiet resilience, a determination that mirrored Elias's own unspoken yearning for something more than the life he had resigned himself to after years of loss and solitude. He had found the creature earlier that evening, or perhaps it had found him, its trembling form appearing like an echo on his doorstep, pawing softly at the weathered wood as if seeking shelter, and without thinking, Elias had opened the door and knelt beside it, his hand shaking not from fear, but from the strange certainty that this moment was significant, that this was no ordinary animal, but something tethered to a mystery older than the town itself. And as he had gathered the wounded creature into his arms, cradling its weight against his chest, he had felt an almost imperceptible warmth seep into his skin, as if the dog's heartbeat was sinking with his own. And now, as he stood at the edge of Wren Hollow, he felt an invisible pull drawing him toward the heart of the forest, where stories whispered by the elders of his childhood had taken root, the stories of the Hollow Guardian, a spirit said to appear in times of great need to guide the lost and heal the broken, though few believed those tales anymore, dismissing them as quaint folklore in an age where technology and reason left little room for faith in unseen things. But Elias had never fully let go of those stories, for they were woven into the fabric of his earliest memories, told to him by his grandmother as she rocked him by the fire, her voice low and reverent as she spoke of the guardian who took many forms but always returned when Wren Hollow cried out for mercy. And though Elias had long since buried his belief beneath layers of grief and skepticism, the sight of this wounded dog, this creature whose eyes shimmered with something eternal, had unraveled those layers in a matter of hours, and now he found himself stepping forward, deeper into the shadowed path, each footfall muffled by damp leaves as his mind raced with questions he dared not yet give voice to. And as they walked, Elias and the dog he had come to call Ash, he felt memories stir that he had thought forgotten, the warmth of his grandmother's embrace, the lull of her stories, the small village festivals where lanterns floated on the river like stars come down to earth, all of it washing over him in waves that made his chest ache with a longing he had not known he carried. The hollow grew denser as they progressed, the trees crowding close as though listening, their branches arching overhead to form a cathedral of shifting shadows and light. And Elias noticed strange markings carved into the trunks, symbols he half remembered from the old stories, spirals and loops that seemed to hum faintly when he passed his fingers over them, and Ash, despite his injuries, moved with steady purpose, occasionally pausing to glance back at Elias with eyes that glowed faintly in the gloom, urging him onward until they reached a clearing Elias had not seen since he was a child, though it seemed unchanged by the passage of time, a ring of standing stones at its center, each one etched with more of those mysterious symbols. And in that moment, as the wind stilled and the night grew unnaturally quiet, Elias felt a weight settle on his shoulders, as though unseen eyes were watching, and he heard a voice, not with his ears, but deep within his mind, a voice that said, "Remember, it was not a command, but an invocation," and with it came a flood of images, faces he did not recognize but felt he should, places that seemed familiar though he had never seen them before, and at the center of it all was Ash, standing proud and whole, his wounds gone, his body aglow with a soft radiance that made Elias's throat tighten with wonder and fear. The voice spoke again, softer this time, telling him that the guardian returned when the balance tipped toward despair, that Ash was the latest vessel in an unbroken line of protectors who bore the pain of the world, and returned it as hope. And Elias, who had long since forgotten how to hope, found tears stinging his eyes as he knelt within the circle of stones, his hands trembling as he reached toward Ash, who lowered his head to press his muzzle into Elias's palm, and the warmth that surged between them was no longer faint, but fierce, as though the pulse of the earth itself had leapt into his veins, and for the first time in years Elias felt alive, connected, necessary. They stayed in the clearing until dawn, the first light illuminating the faded carvings and casting long shadows that seemed to dance around them. And when they returned to town, something had changed, not only within Elias, but in the people themselves, as if the old stories had stirred from slumber and whispered themselves into waking hearts. And where before there had been indifference, there was now a flicker of belief, of curiosity, and in the days that followed, Elias found himself sought out by neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid him, their faces open with cautious hope as they asked about the dog, about the guardian, about whether it was true that the hollow still remembered their names. And Elias, who had lived so long in silence, found himself speaking again, telling stories that were not just his, but belonged to them all, stories that spoke of healing, of reconciliation, of finding light in unexpected places. And Ash, ever at his side, seemed to listen with a calm wisdom that made Elias believe that perhaps, after all this time, he had found his place in the world again. Yet peace was a fragile thing, and as autumn deepened, whispers of a growing darkness beyond the valley reached them. Fishermen spoke of strange lights beneath the waters of Wren Lake. Hunters returned from the eastern woods with hollow stares and no memory of where they had been, and the village children began to dream of shadows that watched them from windows and doorways, waiting for something only they could sense. And Elias, feeling the old weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders once more, knew that the time had come to journey deeper into the hollow, beyond the familiar paths, into the ancient places where the boundary between worlds was thinnest, where the last guardians had once stood against the darkness and either triumphed or vanished. Ash led the way, his steps sure despite the growing unease that prickled along Elias's spine, and they traveled for days through landscapes that defied explanation, forests where the trees whispered secrets in languages no living tongue had spoken for centuries, rivers that ran with silver light instead of water, and ruins of cities older than memory, their broken stones still warm to the touch, as if they had only recently been abandoned. Each night Elias dreamed of the balance, a great scale suspended above the world, its pans tipping perilously as unseen forces warred for dominion, and always, in these dreams, he saw Ash standing beneath it, holding back the fall with quiet strength. But the weight was increasing, and Elias knew they would need more than hope to restore what was failing. In one such dream, he saw her, Solène, a woman whose name tasted familiar on his tongue, though he could not remember ever meeting her. And when they found her days later, waiting at a crossroads with a staff of ash wood and eyes like storm clouds, Elias felt the strange certainty that they had known each other across lifetimes, bound by an oath neither had made, but both were destined to fulfill. Solène spoke of the seals, ancient bindings set in place by the first guardians to protect the world from what lay beneath, and now those seals were failing, their power unraveling as the old songs were forgotten, and it would be up to them, the last circle, as the old tales called them, to mend the fracture or witness the descent into ruin. Together they pressed onward, gathering others who still remembered the ways of balance. Leontes, the smith who forged silver blades that could cut through lies and illusion. Kayla, the singer whose voice could mend broken things. And an old scholar named Bram, who carried in his mind the last maps of the hollow, before it had shifted and become the labyrinth it now was. Each brought their strength, but each also carried scars, stories of loss that weighed heavily on the fragile unity they tried to forge, and Elias, who had thought himself alone in his grief, found solace in their companionship even as the journey grew darker, the hollow revealing its deepest wounds, chasms where the land bled light, forests petrified into twisted stone, rivers choked with ash, and always ahead, the growing certainty that they were being watched by something vast and patient, something that waited just beyond sight, ready to unmake all they fought for. In time, they reached the first seal, a monolith of obsidian carved with lines of light that pulsed faintly as they approached. And as Elias laid his hand upon its cold surface, he felt Ash press close to his side, the dog's breath warm against his wrist. And he remembered the voice that had called him to remember, and he spoke aloud the name his grandmother had whispered to him so many years ago, and the seal responded, its light flaring bright enough to banish shadow, and the wound in the world there began to mend. But there were 6 seals in all, and the road ahead promised trials that would test not only their strength, but the very faith they had only just begun to reclaim. The journey beyond the first seal was unlike anything Elias had dared to imagine. Where once the hollow was tangled with shadow and gloom, it now opened in sweeping vistas of eerie beauty, as though they had stepped into a place untouched by time or reason. The air itself shimmered faintly with motes of golden light, drifting lazily like embers on an unseen breeze, and the sky above, though cloudless, churned with colors that defied simple names. Ash trotted ahead, his stride lighter, his coat taking on a silvery sheen that seemed to absorb and reflect the strange luminescence around them, and for a time Elias allowed himself to believe they might succeed, that the stories of the Hollow Guardians would not end with failure and silence. Solène walked at his side, her staff leaving faint trails of light in its wake, as though it drew unseen lines of energy from the ground itself. And though her face was often grave, there were moments when she smiled, small fleeting gestures that made Elias's heart lift in ways he had long since forgotten. Their band had grown closer during the long nights by the fire, each member revealing fragments of their past as they shared bread and stories. And in those quiet moments, Elias realized he was no longer alone, no longer the solitary man haunted by what he had lost. Bram, the scholar, had begun to sketch the new lands they crossed, his parchment unrolling longer with each passing day, mapping places that had not been charted in any living memory, and Leontis, the smith, took to collecting rare metals and strange stones along their path, forging simple tokens of protection that he gifted to each of them without ceremony. Kayla, whose voice had healed them in small, unseen ways, sang softly each night, her songs weaving through their dreams and giving them the strength to face another day, and Elias found that their hope was not a fragile thing at all, but something fierce and tenacious, like the roots of ancient trees gripping deep into the earth. But hope alone could not hold back the creeping dark that gnawed at the edges of their journey. As they approached the place where the second seal was said to lie, the land grew corrupted. Rivers ran thick with black water that steamed when touched by light, and forests stood silent, their bark cracked and weeping a tar-like sap that stuck to their boots and made every step an effort. The dreams they shared grew darker, haunted by visions of hollow-eyed figures and cities burning beneath a sky split open with crimson lightning. Elias awoke more than once to find Ash staring into the darkness beyond their campfire, his body tense, his teeth bared in silent warning. Whatever watched them was drawing closer, and they knew they had precious little time. The second seal lay beneath the ruins of a temple older than any recorded in Bram's tomes, its stones cracked and covered in symbols worn nearly smooth by the endless passage of years. Solène led them in a quiet chant as they descended the wide stairwell into darkness, their torches flaring strangely in the heavy air. At the heart of the temple they found it, a great stone disk sunk into the floor, its surface carved with a labyrinthine pattern of lines that pulsed faintly with dim blue light. But as Elias approached, the air thickened and the cold seeped deep into his bones. A shadow coalesced in the far corner of the room, an indistinct shape at first, but soon a figure emerged, tall and thin, its face hidden by a mask of bone carved into a mockery of a human face. Its presence filled the chamber with a pressure that made it hard to breathe, and though it spoke no words, Elias heard it clearly in his mind. "You are too late," it said, its voice dry as ash. "This world belongs to me." Ash growled low in his throat and took a step forward, his body tensed to strike, but Elias held out a hand. "No," Elias said quietly, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. "It doesn't." He knelt at the edge of the seal and laid both hands on its cold surface, ignoring the burn of frostbite that spread through his skin. He closed his eyes and remembered his grandmother's stories, the warmth of her voice, the strength of those who had come before. He spoke the words she had taught him, words that had no meaning in any language he knew. And the seal answered. Light flared outward in a sudden burst, blinding and pure, and the shadow screamed, its form unraveling like smoke caught in a gale. The darkness receded, and when Elias opened his eyes again, the seal shone bright and strong, its patterns clear and whole once more. Ash sat beside him, his fur crackling faintly with energy, his eyes bright with approval. They had done it, But the cost was becoming clear. The deeper they traveled, the more the darkness fought back, and Elias knew that the further seals would be even harder to reach. They rested for a time, gathering strength, but soon the pull of the journey drew them onward again. The path to the third seal took them through lands that shifted beneath their feet, plains that rolled like waves on the ocean, hills that rose and fell as if breathing. Strange creatures watched from the edges of their sight, some curious, others clearly malevolent, and more than once they were forced to fight, Leontis's blades gleaming silver in the half-light as they cut through things that bled smoke and vanished with shrieks that echoed for miles. Kayla's songs soothed their wounds, but even her voice could not mend the exhaustion that settled deep into their bones. When at last they reached the third seal, it was hidden beneath a lake of black glass, its surface unbroken and smooth. They camped at its edge for 2 days, searching for a way through, and it was Ash who finally found the answer. He walked out onto the lake without hesitation, his paws leaving faint ripples that spread in concentric circles. Elias followed, his breath catching as the glass softened beneath his feet, becoming water just long enough for him to step forward. At the center of the lake, the surface broke open, revealing a staircase of light descending into the depths. They followed it down, their forms reflected in 1,000 shifting mirrors, and at the bottom they found the seal, suspended in a sphere of liquid light. But as Elias reached for it, the lake convulsed, and the mirrors shattered, revealing dozens of twisted versions of themselves, dark reflections with empty eyes and cruel smiles. The battle was brutal, and for the first time, Elias feared they would not prevail. Solène fought with wild grace, her staff cracking bone and splitting flesh, while Leontis's blades flashed like falling stars. Bram, despite his age, wielded ancient words of power, and Kayla's voice became a weapon, a song that cut through darkness like a blade. Elias faced himself, his reflection sneering at him, taunting him with every failure, every loss. But he refused to give in. He drove his blade, gifted by Leontis, through its chest, and it dissolved into smoke. At last they reached the seal, and Elias once more spoke the words of his grandmother, sealing away the darkness that had begun to seep into this place. 3 seals remained. The path ahead was darker still, but Elias no longer doubted. They would see this through to the end, no matter the cost. The 4th seal awaited them beyond the borders of the known maps, in a place the old stories called the Hollow Expanse, a wasteland of shifting sands and endless storms where the stars themselves were said to fall and shatter upon the earth. They stood at its threshold, a great canyon yawning before them, its cliffs carved into jagged teeth by winds that howled with the cries of the lost. Bram consulted his scrolls with a furrowed brow, tracing lines that seemed to vanish beneath his fingers, as if the land itself refused to be drawn. "There's nothing," he murmured, "no path." And yet Ash moved forward without hesitation, stepping lightly along an invisible trail that none of them could see. One by one, they followed, their trust in the guardian's instinct outweighing their fear of what lay ahead. The wind tore at their cloaks and lashed their faces raw, but they pressed on, each step a defiance against the despair that lurked in the hollow silence between the gales. It was during these endless hours of trudging through dust and shadow that Elias came to understand the true nature of the Hollow's test. It was not the monsters or the traps, but the relentless erosion of hope, the quiet temptation to give up and turn back, to lay down and let the wind claim you. They passed skeletons buried halfway in the sand, some human, others unrecognizable, grim reminders of those who had tried and failed. But Ash's presence kept them moving. Where his paws touched, the sand seemed firmer, the winds less fierce, as though some unseen force carved a safe passage just wide enough for them to pass. When at last the storm broke, they found themselves before a great obelisk of black stone, half buried in the dune. The fourth seal was not a hidden mechanism or a puzzle, but a guardian, a colossal being wrought of obsidian and bone, its empty eye sockets glowing faintly with red embers. It rose as they approached, dragging a blade larger than a man across the sand with a sound like screaming metal. Leontis stepped forward first. His twin swords crossed over his chest, and Kayla began to sing, not the songs of healing, but an ancient hymn of war, her voice rising in defiance against the oppressive silence of the wasteland. Bram whispered words of binding, weaving a net of light around the beast, but it shrugged off the magic as though it were cobwebs. Selene's staff flashed with strikes of pure force, each blow cracking against the thing's hide, but even she was forced back by its relentless advance. Elias stood his ground. He knew, without knowing how, that the seal's guardian could not be defeated by strength alone. Ash turned to him, meeting his gaze, and for a moment he understood. This was not a battle of power, but of will. He stepped forward, placing himself between the creature and his friends, and lowered his weapon. "We are not here to conquer," he said quietly. "We are here to restore." His voice was almost lost in the wind, but the creature paused. Its burning gaze locked on Elias, and slowly it lowered its blade. Ash sat beside him, silent and watchful. Elias extended his hand and placed it against the cold, cracked surface of the obelisk. He spoke the words again, those ancient syllables his grandmother had taught him, and the seal responded. Light fissured through the stone like veins of molten gold, and with a thunderous crack, the guardian dissolved into dust. The wind stilled. They had passed the fourth seal. Their reprieve was brief. Beyond the hollow expanse lay the broken vale, a land once fertile and green, now twisted and decayed by centuries of corruption. Trees stood like skeletal hands clawing at the bruised sky, and rivers ran thick with sludge. The people who had once lived here were long gone, but their empty villages remained, haunted by shadows that whispered through crumbling doorways. Elias felt the weight of grief here more than anywhere else, a heaviness that clung to his skin like damp wool. But Ash moved forward undeterred, and they followed. At the heart of the vale stood the ruins of a great citadel, its towers collapsed, its walls blackened by fire. Bram explained in hushed tones that this had once been the seat of the Hollow Guardians, before the balance was broken and the darkness spread. It was here they found the fifth seal, buried beneath the shattered floor of the central hall. They unearthed it carefully, brushing away centuries of ash and stone to reveal a circle of silver inlaid with 7 glyphs. But as they worked, they heard movement in the shadows, low growls and soft footfalls. The shadows of the fallen guardians had risen to defend what remained of their charge. These were not mindless shades, but echoes of warriors, their armor rusted, their swords stained with old blood. They circled the party slowly, their hollow eyes fixed on Elias. He stood slowly, meeting their gaze. "We are here to finish what you began," he said, his voice steady, despite the fear coiling in his goo. "We do not seek to take, but to heal." For a long moment, there was only silence. Then one of the shades, taller than the rest, its helm marked with the sigil of the first guardian, stepped forward and laid its blade at Elias's feet. Slowly, one by one, the others followed, and as they knelt, their forms dissolved into motes of light that drifted toward the seal, filling it with a quiet radiance. Elias knelt, placing his hands on the glyphs, and spoke the words once more. The fifth seal broke with a sound like distant thunder, and the corruption in the veil began to recede. Green returned to the fields and patches, and the air grew lighter. Only one seal remained, the final gate, said to rest at the very center of the world, where the threads of life and death wove together. They descended beneath the citadel into tunnels older than history, their walls carved with stories of the first guardians and the balance they protected. The deeper they went, the more the air shimmered with unseen energy, and Elias felt his own heartbeat slow, as if aligning with something ancient and vast. They reached a great cavern, lit by a massive crystal at its center, suspended above a pool of still water. The final gate was not a physical door, but a choice, a reckoning. A voice spoke to them not in words, but in pure thought, and each of them was shown their greatest fear, their deepest failure. Elias saw the faces of those he had lost, the family he had failed to protect, the village he had abandoned in his grief. He felt the weight of every choice he had ever regretted. But then Ash was beside him, pressing close, his warmth grounding him in the present. "You are not alone," the voice said, and Elias realized it was true. He stood, tears streaking his face, and took a step toward the crystal. One by one, the others joined him. Together, they placed their hands on its surface, and in that moment they offered themselves, not as conquerors or saviors,
but as stewards of the balance. The light from the crystal flared, filling the cavern with blinding brilliance. When it faded, the pool below shimmered with new life, and the air was sweet with the scent of growing things. They had restored the balance, but their journey was not yet over. They returned to the surface to find the world slowly healing. Trees blossomed where before there had been rot. Rivers ran clear, and the sky was no longer bruised but bright. The people of the hollow welcomed them not as heroes, but as kin. Elias, once a man lost in his grief, found purpose once more. Ash remained at his side, no longer a wounded stray, but the true guardian reborn. Together, they rebuilt what had been broken, not just in the world, but in themselves. And in the quiet of the hollow, under stars that once again sang with light, Elias Thorne finally found peace. Yet even as the hollow healed and life returned to the lands once blighted by darkness, Elias Thorne understood that the restoration of the balance was not an end but a beginning. And though the scars of the past could never truly be erased, they became part of something greater, a testament to survival, to endurance, and to the quiet strength that allowed people to hope again. In the months that followed, Elias and his companions dedicated themselves to the long and difficult task of rebuilding not just the physical remnants of their world, but the faith and unity that had been eroded over centuries of fear and silence. The citadel, once the broken heart of the Vale, became a place of gathering once more. Its halls echoed with the laughter of children and the solemn oaths of new guardians sworn to protect the fragile balance now restored. So Len remained at Elias's side, her wisdom and unshakable resolve guiding the new council as they forged a future from the ashes of what was lost. Bram, ever the scholar, found purpose in chronicling their journey, filling page after page with the truths that had nearly been forgotten, recording not just their victories, but the costs they had borne to achieve them. Leonis took up the mantle of training the next generation protectors, his fierce discipline tempered by the compassion he had found on their journey. His voice no longer sharp with anger, but firm with a hard-earned hope. Kayla's songs became the heartbeat of the hollow, her music carrying over fields and rivers, a constant reminder of both sorrow and joy, of endings that were also beginnings. And Ash remained more than any of them could have dreamed. No longer merely a guardian in form, but something far greater, a bridge between the old world and the new. Where he walked, flowers bloomed even in stone, and his gaze, still deep with ancient knowledge, had softened with a quiet joy that spoke of peace found after endless struggle. For Elias, there were days when he awoke in the stillness before dawn and wondered if he had only dreamed the long and harrowing journey through the seals, the guardians, the hollow expanse, and the final gate. But then Ash would be there, resting his great head on Elias's knee, and Solen's voice would call into council, and the laughter of children would ring out beyond the citadel walls, and he would know this life was real. And yet, he could not entirely let go of the feeling that something more waited beyond the horizon, that the world was vast and deep and full of mysteries still unsolved. He had seen what lay beyond the veil, touched the raw thread of life and death, and though he had found peace in the hollow, he knew his journey was not yet complete. So it was that one morning, as the frost clung to fields and the first light of the sun broke over the distant peaks, Elias gathered his cloak, shouldered his pack, and set out once more, this time not out of desperation or fear, but with a heart lightened by hope and purpose. Ash padded silently at his side, their steps easy and unhurried, as if the road itself had been waiting for them. Solen stood at the gates, watching him with eyes that understood, offering no words of farewell, because none were needed. Bram pressed a bundle of maps into his hands, muttering about new lands and old legends that might yet prove true. Leonis clasped his shoulder in a grip that spoke volumes, and Kayla sang a single note, pure and bright, as if to send him safely into the wide world. And so Elias walked on, not away from the hollow, but towards something unseen and yet known, as though the pulse of the world itself was calling him onward once again. They crossed mountains that shimmered with frost like powdered diamonds, valleys that echoed with the songs of creatures thought long extinct, and rivers so clear they seemed made of glass. In distant towns, Elias found remnants of the old world, places where belief had flickered but never died completely, where whispers of guardians and seals still drifted through hearth-side tales. He listened to those stories with the quiet reverence of a man who knew their truth, and sometimes, when a village needed it most, Ash would reveal his light, and for a time, the people would remember what it meant to believe. Yet even as they moved further from the hollow, Elias carried it with him, not as a burden, but as a promise. Months turned to years. The hollow thrived in his absence, tended by those who had grown strong in his stead, and the stories of Elias Thorne passed from mouth to mouth, not as myth, but as history. He was spoken of not as a savior, but as one who had walked through darkness and emerged carrying light. Some said he was the last guardian. Others said he was merely the first of a new line, but all who told his tale spoke of hope renewed. And though the world continued to change, as all living things must, there remained a thread that ran through it all, unbroken and shining, the legacy of one man's journey to restore what was lost on a quiet evening. Many years after he had left the hollow behind, Elias stood on the edge of another sea, its waves gentle against a shore of white stone, and watched the stars fell like silver rain beyond the horizon. Ash lay beside him, old now, though his eyes still gleamed with the same quiet knowing. Elias breathed in the salt air, feeling the weight of his years settle into something easy and light. He smiled, thinking of Solen and Bram, Leontes and Kayla, of the hollow's green fields and clear rivers, and he knew that it had all been worth it. As he stood there, a child's voice called out behind him, asking for a story, and Elias turned, his heart lifting. He knelt, beckoning the child closer, and as he began to speak, of guardians and balance, of darkness and light, of the long path home, the stars above seemed to listen, their light steady and bright. And far away, in the heart of Wren Hollow, where the wind whispered through ancient trees and the stones of the old citadel warmed in the morning sun, the world was at peace.
But even as peace settled like morning mist over the hollow, and the distant lands Elias had traveled, the quiet he found was not one of finality, but a transition, like the hush between one heartbeat and the next, filled with the potential for new beginnings. The child at his knee, bright-eyed and hungry for stories, reminded Elias of himself long ago, sitting at his grandmother's hearth, listening to tales that had shaped his belief in things unseen. As he told the story of Ash, of the seals, and the restoration of the balance, the child listened with rapt attention, and others began to gather, men and women, young and old, until there was a quiet crowd, sitting in the fading light, their faces softened by wonder. And Elias realized something then. Stories, as much as courage and sacrifice, were what held the world together. They were the breath and bone of memory, the thread by which hope was passed from one generation to the next. He finished speaking only when the stars wheeled overhead in their slow, eternal dance, and when he rose, there was an ease in his movements that had not been there in years that night, beneath a canopy of constellations he did not know. Elias dreamed. In the dream, he stood once more before the great tree at the heart of Wren Hollow, its branches heavy with silver leaves that whispered like rain. Solène stood beside him, younger, her eyes bright with laughter, and Bram was there, scribbling furiously in his journal, even as he tried to hide a smile. Leonti sparred with invisible foes in the background, his movements graceful as a dance, while Kayla sat cross-legged at the roots of the tree, plucking at a lyre and singing softly to herself. Ash, whole and ageless, lay at Elias's feet, his gaze turned towards something distant yet near, something calling from beyond the veil. When Elias woke, he found his hand resting on Ash's flank, the dog's steady breathing a quiet comfort in the pre-dawn stillness, and so the years passed. Sometimes Elias traveled, sometimes he stayed in places long enough to learn the names of rivers and the stories of the hills. He taught those who would listen, not just about the seals or the balance, but about kindness and courage, and the strength found in unity. He became a healer of sorts, stitching together what had been broken, not with magic, but with patience, listening, and understanding. Ash was always with him, his presence a constant reminder of what they had fought for, of what they still protected. But change, as always, came on quiet feet. One autumn, as the leaves turned to fire and gold, Ash began to slow. His steps, once tireless, grew careful. His eyes, though still bright, held a deeper weariness. Elias knew the time was nearing when Ash's journey in this form would end, and he prepared himself as best he could, though the ache in his heart was sharp and persistent. They returned to Wren Hollow together, walking paths overgrown and forgotten by most. There, under the ancient canopy, Ash lay down one final time, his breath slow and deep. Elias sat with him through the night, speaking softly of all they had seen, all they had done. And when the dawn came, and Ash's body faded like mist under the first rays of sun, Elias wept, not with despair, but with gratitude. Ash's light rose in a quiet column, joining the branches of the great tree, and Elias knew that the guardian had not ended, only changed. Life in Wren Hollow flourished. The citadel had become not only a place of governance, but of learning and song. Solène's descendants led with wisdom tempered by compassion. Bram's writings became tomes of knowledge, passed from hand to hand across the lands. Leonti's teachings lived on in the disciplined, yet kind warriors who patrolled the roads and borders, ensuring peace held firm. Kayla's music was sung in distant lands by those who had never seen the hollow, yet knew its name by heart. And Elias? In time, he too became a story. Some said he walked beyond the edges of the world, seeking what lay past the last horizon. Others whispered he had become one with the guardian, his spirit entwined with ashes in the tree's silver branches. A few believed he had simply found rest, his long journey at an end, his work complete. But in every tale, no matter how altered by time and distance, one truth remained. Elias Thorne had brought hope when it was most needed, and the balance endured because he had believed it could. The world, once fractured by shadow and loss, now bloomed in ways no one had thought possible. Magic returned, not as something to be feared, but as a quiet gift, guiding healers, blessing the harvest, bringing warmth to cold places. And everywhere, from the cities rising in places once silent to the humble villages tucked between rivers and forests, people remembered. They lit lanterns on certain nights and set them floating on the wind or water, each light a promise, a remembrance, a hope, and perhaps somewhere beyond the stars Elias watched still. But as the seasons passed and the echoes of Elias Thorne's footsteps faded into legend, there remained those who still felt his presence, as if the hollow itself had not truly let him go. Children born under quiet moons often claim to see a figure at the edge of the woods, standing tall, his cloak rustling like leaves on a windless night, Ash pacing beside him, his twilight gray fur aglow. The old ones whispered that in times of great need, the guardian and his companion would walk the hollow paths once again. And though Solen's line carried on with steady hands and Bram's records grew, fat with new knowledge, it was the unspoken hope of many that Elias still watched over them, his promise to protect and restore enduring beyond even death. The citadel itself became a place of pilgrimage. Those seeking answers to mysteries of their own, those burdened by grief or purpose, came to stand at the great silver tree, laying their palms upon its ancient bark. Some said they heard whispers there, soft as distant thunder. Others claimed their dreams were clearer afterward, their paths illuminated by unseen stars. No war found its way to Wren Hollow again, not in those days, nor for many generations after. The world had healed, those scars remained, as they always do, but the people learned that scars were not shameful. They were signs of survival. Proof that even in brokenness, beauty could take root, but far beyond Wren Hollow, in distant lands where Elias's name was only vaguely known, darker whispers stirred. Beneath cracked stone temples long buried by sand and time, something woke. A pulse in the earth, a hunger long denied. The guardians had mended the balance, yes, but such balance was never permanent. The world shifted as it always did, and those who watched from the shadows waited patiently for their moment to come again. In the deep forests of the West, a young woman named Mira walked beneath the eaves of trees older than empires, her hand upon the hilt of a blade she had inherited but did not yet understand. Her dreams were filled with visions of a man with silver in his hair and sorrow in his eyes, and a great dog whose gaze saw through her, as if weighing her worth. Mira knew nothing of Wren Hollow, save the half-remembered songs her mother used to hum by firelight, but something inside her ached when she thought of that place, and one night, under a sky bruised with storm clouds, she turned her face east and began walking toward it. The journey was long, as such journeys must be, and along the way she gathered others, some broken, some lost, all searching. There was Wren, who spoke to birds and claimed he once flew in dreams. There was Kiva, whose hands could mend flesh as easily as they wove cloth. And there was Davos, a man with quiet rage buried beneath layers of guilt and silence. Together, they crossed mountains that bled ash and valleys where bones whispered of forgotten wars, and everywhere they went, Mira dreamed. Always of the same man, always of Ash. And then, one night, they reached Wren Hollow. The citadel rose, gleaming white stone against green hills, and though it was grander than the song that said, there was a deep sadness in the air. The balance, it seemed, was tilting again. Mira knelt at the silver tree, her hand trembling as she touched its bark. No voice spoke to her. No vision came. But the bark was warm beneath her fingers, and something loosened inside her chest. A knot she hadn't known was there unraveled, and she wept without understanding why. It was Solen's descendant, a woman named Alice, who found her there and brought her into the citadel, and over time, Mira learned of Elias Thorne, of Ash, of the seals, and the balance. She read Bram's writings until her eyes blurred, and listened to Leontise's training rituals recited by those who still followed his path. But still, something was missing. She felt it like a stone in her shoe, a weight she could not shake. And then, one night, beneath the same autumn moon that had shone on Elias so many years before, Mira dreamed again. But this time, the silver-haired man did not speak. He simply pointed toward the north, where the mountains clawed at the sky, and the wind howled like a wounded thing. When she woke, she knew. She would have to leave Wren Hollow. She would have to go where Elias had not, to places the guardians had long feared to tread. For balance was not only a matter of restoration, but of understanding the darkness, too. With her companions, she journeyed north, through lands untouched by song or story. They found ruins half swallowed by earth, and in them, murals that told of something older than the balance, older even than the Guardians. A force that was neither good nor evil, but hungry for motion, for chaos. And in its shadow, they found echoes of Elias. His handprints on stone. His symbols carved with deliberate care, as if he had known one day someone like Mira would come. And so Mira followed his trail, though it was faint and old. She fought things that did not bleed but wept when cut. She heard songs that clawed at the mind. And always, she walked toward the truth Elias had not lived to see. When she reached the end of the world, she found a door. It was simple, unmarked, weathered by time. And beside it, carved in ancient tongue, words she only understood because Elias had dreamed them into her. Here lies the first balance, and beyond the beginning. Mira stepped through, and the story, as stories often do, began again. Beyond the threshold, Mira stepped into a space unlike anything she had ever imagined. It was not a room nor a tunnel, but a vast expanse of twilight mist and shifting stars, as if she had crossed from the solid world into a memory woven by something ancient and dreaming. The ground beneath her boots felt both firm and soft, like standing on a lake that had forgotten how to be water. Wren, Kiva, and Davos followed close behind, their breath shallow, their eyes wide, as the space hummed around them with a pulse that was neither sound nor light, but something in between. They moved forward, guided not by sight, but by instinct, until a shape emerged from a haze, a monolith, dark as obsidian, but carved with lines of silver that ran like rivers of light across its surface. Mira approached it with careful reverence, her fingers tingling as she reached out and touched the stone. At her touch, the silver lines brightened, forming symbols she did not know but somehow understood. Balance is choice. Choice is weight. Weight is memory. Memory is life. She whispered the words as they appeared, her voice trembling but clear, and the monolith responded, opening with a slow groan that echoed through the vastness like thunder across a distant valley. Inside was a narrow passage, its walls slick with a faint, living luminescence, and they descended together, each step taking them deeper into a truth they could no longer deny. They reached a chamber at the bottom, circular and impossibly vast, where an orb of light hovered above a pedestal, radiating warmth and sorrow in equal measure. Around its base were 6 pillars, each cracked and broken, as if whatever power had once held them firm had long since faded. And on each pillar was an engraving of a figure, guardians of old, Mira realized. She saw the face of Elias Thorn among them, his eyes carved with such depth that she felt they were watching her still, judging, waiting. Kiva knelt beside the pedestal, her healer's hands tracing the fractures in the stone, while Wren muttered soft prayers to gods Mira had never heard of, and Davos stood silent, his eyes on the orb as if daring it to reveal something terrible. Mira stepped closer, her pulse steady despite the enormity of what lay before them. The orb brightened as she neared, and in its light, she saw visions, cities rising and falling, oceans consuming mountains, stars flaring and dying in silent screams. She saw guardians standing against tides of shadow, and she saw them failing. Again and again they fought, and again they were undone, not by their enemies, but by the weight of their own choices, their own burdens. She saw Elias, kneeling at the foot of the silver tree, Ash at his side, weeping as he watched a future unravel that he could not stop. Myra's breath caught, and tears filled her eyes, but she did not look away. She stepped forward and placed her hands on either side of the orb, its warmth searing into her palms, and she spoke aloud the only truth she could hold to in that moment. "I am not Elias Thorn," she said, "but I will stand as he did." The chamber responded, the orb pulsing with blinding light, and a low hum filled the air, rising to a crescendo that shook the stone beneath their feet. The broken pillars cracked further, then healed before their eyes, silver light mending the ancient scars. The faces of the guardians brightened, their eyes closing as if in peace at last, and the orb dimmed until it became a soft, steady glow, a heartbeat, Mira realized, slow and strong. Kiva stood and took Myra's hand, her fingers tight. "What happens now?" she asked. Mira shook her head. "We hold the balance, and we teach those who come after." They left the chamber, the path behind them closing in silence, as if the world itself had exhaled. When they emerged from the threshold, the sky above Wren Hollow was streaked with dawn, golden and pink and full of promise. Word spread quickly, as such things always do, and soon people came again to the silver tree, their questions quieter, their hopes less desperate, but more honest. Mira and her companions became guardians in truth, not because of power or destiny, but because they chose to be. They stood watch at the edges of old stories and new beginnings, guiding those who wandered close to the balance and back again. And far away, in places Mira had yet to see, others woke to the call of choice, their feet turning toward paths long thought lost. The story did not end, nor did it truly begin again, for such stories are rivers that flow endlessly, sometimes deep, sometimes shallow, but always moving toward a horizon that none can see, yet all can hope for. The story did not end, nor did it truly begin again, for such stories are rivers that flow endlessly, sometimes deep, sometimes shallow, but always moving toward a horizon that none can see, yet all can hope for. And so it was that Wren Hollow settled once more into a quiet rhythm, its people tending to fields and stories with equal care, the citadel no longer a place of war and worry, but a haven where knowledge was kept, and peace was nurtured like a garden whose roots ran deep. Mira and her companions remained within its walls for a time, guiding those who came seeking wisdom or healing, teaching those who would listen about the fragile weight of balance and the choices that shaped it. Yet Mira could not shake the feeling that her place was not only within the safety of stone halls and silver trees, but out in the wide and shifting world where balance was less a word and more a desperate hope. And so, after the long winter thawed into spring and the rivers swelled with meltwater, Mira left again, this time alone, walking east into the lands where old maps faltered and stories thinned to rumor and silence. She carried with her only the blade of her ancestors, newly reforged in the citadel's fires, and the memories of those who had come before, whispering to her in dreams and moments of stillness. She did not seek battle nor glory, but understanding, for in the chamber beyond the threshold she had seen something she had not yet spoken aloud, the possibility that balance was not a single point to be held firm, but a dance between forces forever shifting, a conversation between light and dark that must be heard anew in every place and time. And so she listened. She listened to the wind through the broken towers of forgotten kingdoms, to the slow breathing of ancient forests where no human foot had fallen in 100 lifetimes, and to the stories told in hushed voices by people who had survived more than they had ever hoped to. In these places, Mira found echoes of Elias Thorne's journey, though no clear path had been left for her to follow. Instead, there were signs, a symbol carved into an old wellstone, an offering left beneath the roots of a tree that grew in a place of sorrow, a song hummed by a child whose eyes mirrored the sky before dawn. She followed these threads patiently, weaving them into her own story until they became inseparable from her breath and bone. And in doing so, she understood that Elias had not meant for his legacy to be a path at all, but an invitation. Elsewhere back in Wren Hollow, Alice tended the citadel with gentle strength, her leadership quiet but resolute, as Solen's line had always been. Bram's descendants still added to the great library, their ink-stained fingers tracing old words and new, ensuring that nothing was forgotten. Wren, Kiva, and Davos each found their own callings. Wren returned to his distant home, where he taught others to listen to the language of wings and wind. Kiva founded a hall of healers that welcomed all who sought rest or renewal. Davos remained by the citadel walls, guarding not against enemies, but against the fading of memory, reminding those who came of the cost of what they now enjoyed. Yet beyond them, the world shifted as it always did. Far in the south, beneath crimson sands, a tomb cracked open, and the thing that emerged did not speak, but hungered. In the north, Ice groaned beneath the weight of something stirring, something that remembered the world when it was young and cruel, and filled with fire. And to the west, where Mira wandered, there came a whispering wind that spoke in languages no tongue had shaped for an age, calling to those who might answer its song. One night, as Mira rested beneath the ruins of a stone archway, once carved with blessings for a forgotten god, she dreamed again, not of Elias, nor of Ash, but of herself, standing in a place of mirrors, where every reflection was a different choice she might have made. In one, she turned away from Wren Hollow and lived a quiet life by the sea. In another, she became a tyrant, wielding balance like a weapon. In another still, she never left her village and died before her 20th year. And in all of them, she saw the same truth, that she was not meant to follow a single thread, but to weave them together into something whole. She woke with the dawn, cold and uncertain, but resolved. Her path lay not in what was given, but in what she would choose to give. In time, she found her way to the western cliffs, where the sea battered stone into sand, and there she met others who heard the call of balance and wished to learn. Some were old and bitter, others young and reckless, but all were willing to listen, and so Mira began to teach. Not as Elias had taught, for she was not Elias, but as herself, imperfect, questioning, but steadfast. She told them of the Guardians not as myths, but as people who had erred and loved and fought and died for a world they would never fully understand. She showed them the silver blade, and taught them not how to wield it in battle, but how to understand the weight of drawing it at all. And slowly, the village at the cliff's edge became something more, a place where balance was not guarded like a treasure, but shared like bread at a common table. Seasons passed. Mira grew older. Her hair silvered like Elias's had, though she did not wear a cloak nor carry a staff. She remained a wanderer even when she stood still, her gaze always turned toward horizons unseen. And when at last she felt her time waning, she returned once more to Wren Hollow, where Alice still tended the silver tree, its roots deeper than ever before. They embraced as old friends and sat beneath the tree's vast branches, speaking of days long gone and days yet to come. That night, Mira walked alone into the hollow's heart, to the place where Elias Thorn had first knelt so long ago. There she set down her blade, pressing it point first into the soft earth, and whispered a prayer, not to gods or guardians, but to those who would come after. Then she closed her eyes and became part of the story, as all who had come before her had done. And somewhere far beyond Wren Hollow, in lands untouched by her footsteps, a child was born who dreamed of silver trees and voices in the wind, and so the river flowed on. It carried new faces, new voices, new choices, but the current was the same, always moving, always shifting, toward a horizon none could see, but all could hope for.